That is the serve that Roger Federer has used to win more tennis matches than any other man playing the game today. But Steve Mnuchin could beat him. The Trump Treasury Secretary could beat Federer if we just make an assumption or two. The fastest serve Roger Federer has ever hit sent the ball across the net at 143 miles an hour. So if we assume that Steve Mnuchin can consistently send serves across the net accurately at 150 miles an hour, then Mnuchin can beat Federer. But no one would ever bet on Steve Mnuchin to beat Roger Federer because no one would ever make such a crazy assumption about Mnuchin's 150-mile-an-hour serve. But this is the season of truly crazy assumptions in Washington among Republicans trying to pass not just the biggest tax cut in history, but what most objective economists see as the worst tax legislation in history. Congress's Joint Tax Committee, which has always been the official scorer of tax legislation, says that the Republican tax cuts will increase the deficit and the debt by $1.5 trillion. But when the Joint Tax Committee changes its assumptions to what they consider very optimistic forecasting for economic growth, they then estimate that the tax cuts will increase the deficit and debt by only $1 trillion, just $1 trillion. That leaves Republicans voting for a bill that adds at least $1 trillion to the national debt. So what can a president who pretends to care about the deficit and debt do about this? Assume it all away. That's what the president and Republicans have decided to do. Just assume that the bill won't increase the deficit. Today, Steve Mnuchin put that assumption in the most ridiculous document ever issued by the Treasury Department to support tax legislation. It is a single page that assumes that the economy will grow at 2.9% because of the tax cuts. And to an economist, this stuff sounds exactly like assuming that Steve Mnuchin or Donald Trump can hit a tennis ball at 150 miles an hour. This piece of paper is a lie. This piece of paper has no one's name on it anywhere. There's no name on it. Steve Mnuchin allowed this piece of paper to be distributed today by the Treasury, but he refused to put his name on it or the name of anyone working in the Treasury Department. Former Treasury secretaries follow a tradition of not criticizing the current Treasury Secretary, even when they're in different parties. But former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers has broken that tradition because of pieces of paper like this. He has broken that tradition because the Trump Republican tax cut package is the worst tax legislation he has ever seen. Former Treasury Secretary and current Harvard economics professor Lawrence Summers joins us next.
No amount of fake math can change the fact that the Republican tax bill will be a boon to the wealthiest of Americans and the largest corporations, while increasing taxes for millions of middle-class families and leaving 13 million people without health care. Republicans still have time to turn back from this ugly, awful bill.
Joining us now for an exclusive interview is Lawrence Summers, Harvard economics professor and former Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton and a former economic advisor to President Obama. Professor Summers, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I know you recall that earlier in the year, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said that there were hundreds of people, he said hundreds of people working in the Treasury Department on their own analysis of the tax plan. And this is what we got today. This one sheet of paper references the Office of Tax Policy, but doesn't actually credit them with doing any work that we recognize here. No names on this. I've never seen a document like this. What was your reaction when you finally saw this?
I've never seen anything like it either. It's not a study. It's a weak press release. It's not an analysis. It's a set of claims. Look, here was the secretary's problem. He has a highly professional career staff. If he let that highly professional career staff do an analysis with dynamic scoring that took account of economic growth and all of that, that staff would reach the same conclusion the Joint Tax Committee staff reached, which is that this bill doesn't come close to paying for itself. Releasing that is what always happens. You ask the nonpartisan staff at the Treasury to score bills. He didn't do that. He had promised an analysis, and so he had to do something. So what he did was he did an analysis that assumed the administration's economic forecast was true. Now, you know, as you showed in your introduction, if I assume I can serve the ball 150 miles an hour, I'd be a hell of a tennis player. If I assumed there was no gravity, I'd be terrific at the high jump. If you make a crazy assumption, then you can get any conclusion you want. So he derived the conclusion that if you took the administration's economic forecast, which is a million miles from the professional consensus, then the administration's conclusion would follow. But nobody believes the administration's economic forecast. Look, many things can happen. And so the way I like to explain it to people, Lawrence, is to say it might turn out to be 70 degrees, in 65 degrees, 70 degrees, something like that, in Washington, D.C. on Christmas Day. You can't say for sure that will not happen, but it's a wildly unreasonable forecast of the temperature on Christmas Day. In the same way, economists don't know that much. Surprises happen. But 2.9% average growth for the next decade isn't anybody's assumption as to what the economy is going to generate going forward. So they've taken an assumption that's absurd, not defended the assumption, and then shown that it's consistent with an absurd conclusion. That's not an analysis. That won't persuade anybody who's trying to look at evidence. I think of the Treasury as a great institution, and I think it was an embarrassing moment for it. And I think all of you in the press and everyone in Congress who believes in good policymaking should want to know what the Treasury staff believes.
You have made a point in a recent op-ed piece, which I haven't seen anyone else make, which is they are selling this as a stimulus. It will provoke economic growth. But you're saying the way the economy is running right now, it can't really absorb or make real use of this kind of stimulus.
I think it's unlikely. I mean, the normal argument for stimulus is when you need to bring down the unemployment rate. That's when you have stimulus. Right now, we've got the lowest unemployment rate in 17 years, and we've got the Fed looking to put the brakes on the expansion by raising rates. What I'd expect if this happens is there'll be more upwards pressure on the economy. Therefore, the Fed will have to hit the brakes harder, and we'll see higher interest rates. And those higher interest rates will burden people who are trying to take out mortgages to buy their first homes, will burden people who have to, unlike Secretary Mnuchin, have to borrow money to buy their car or take out an installment loan to buy furniture. So I think this is another respect in which this is a burdensome and unnecessarily burdensome way to approach the economy.
Former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, thank you very much for joining us once again tonight on this legislation. Really important. Thanks. Really appreciate having you here.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.